Okay, let's go a little more in depth about the cutaneous membrane, right? So as we look at the epidermis, there's a lot going on here. This is where most of our time will be. Now, you can see that in the epidermis, we actually have 5 layers. We'll talk about what all these different strata do. Notice though this 5th layer, or what looks like maybe the 4th layer, stratum lucidum is only found in thick skin, the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, and so we won't spend a ton of time there. Now, I really like this image, 5-3, because it tells you the different layers, but it also tells you kind of what's going on there. And that's where we're going to start. Let's look at the cells, these specialized cells kind of found throughout the epidermis, through the different strata. And then we'll go through the strata, make sure you feel good on what order they come in, and use that also as a chance to kind of review some of these cell types. So the most common cell that you are going to find in the skin is called a keratinocyte. Now that ending site tells you cell. Keratin is a type of protein, right? And these are going to be cells that get filled with this protein. So we'll first see these keratinocytes in the very deepest layer, in the stratum basal, right? Think basal, ground floor, because these stem cells found in the stratum basal are constantly dividing and producing more and more keratinocytes. You'll then see these keratinocytes just getting pushed towards the surface of the skin. By the time they reach the surface, right, in this stratum corneum, those cells are completely dead, right? You can scratch the surface of your skin, maybe it's winter, right? That flakiness, you see the skin cells actually coming off. And of course your book tells you gross facts, like you lose 40 pounds of skin cells in your lifetime or something, right? All that dust in your house, right? A lot of it's actually skin. Sorry, gross. So you actually end up with new skin, right? New surface cells every month or so that is completely regenerated. You might find places where there's lots of mechanical stress, where you might actually get calluses, right? Where you get thicker layers of these keratinocytes trying to protect those underlying structures, right? But so these cells, basically, what you're looking at is they're filled with this protein keratin. But that's a huge portion of those protective properties that we see in the skin. All right, another cell that we'll find is the melanocyte. Right, and these cells produce a pigment called melanin. Right, melanin is this brown pigment. And what happens here, these melanocytes, the cell is in the stratum basal. It's in the deepest layer of the epidermis. It never leaves. But as it produces this melanin, it packages them into these little, they call them melanosomes. It's like a peroxisome or a lysosome, but this little packet is filled with melanin. I think that's spelled right, melanosome, right? And again, this is just a little vesicle of the pigment melanin, and melanocytes are going to hand that off to neighboring keratinocytes, right? It's going to move into their cells, and then as those keratinocytes get pushed to the surface of the skin, it's carrying melanin with them, right? So it's actually exposure to UV radiation. The keratinocytes are going to trigger the melanocytes to make more melanin, right, and move that to the surface of the skin. Your tan is then not permanent, right, because as those cells move to the surface, they're eventually going to shed. They're also going to, those melanosomes kind of get degraded over time in the keratinocytes as well. Let's see, you also have this big fancy cell called a dendritic cell. This dendritic cell is actually very similar to a macrophage. It is a phagocytic cell, a big eater, right? It engulfs foreign microbes, and this is that cell that actually triggers the immune system response. It kind of serves as that early warning system. Hey, if something has gotten into the skin, right, maybe it's gotten into the rest of the body at this point. So that dendritic cell is part of the immune system response, right? Here we go. Tactile cells. The name is a big clue as to its function, right? Notice they're always associated with a nerve ending, a sensory nerve ending. And so this tactile cell is one of those cells that's helping you with that sensation of touch. We'll look at sensory receptors in a little bit more detail as we get into accessory organs, but this is actually just a cell. It lives in the stratum basale, and it's associated with a nerve ending. The old name on that, your book will still tell you, is a Merkel cell. That's who found it, right? But we're definitely seeing this trend now, right, where we're moving towards having names that tell us a little bit more, maybe about what the cell does, isn't named after a person. Same thing, dendritic cells, the old name is a Langerhans cell, but I think I would I will try to use dendritic and tactile cell, and I think that's the language that you'll start seeing a lot more. Okay, so those are our specialized cells in the epithelium. By far, the most abundant is the keratinocyte, right? But it's nice, we get some touch, we get some melanin, we get some immune system response, right? And then all the protection of those many, many keratin layers. Okay, speaking of layers, let's go ahead and dive in. So I'll use this cartoon as a little bit of background, maybe with less things going on that can help you. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at these layers that make up the epidermis, right? The deepest layer, right, and that's kind of where we started with some of our cells too, is the stratum basal, deep, right? Again, at this point, we have a lot of stem cells, cells that are actively undergoing mitosis to produce more keratinocytes. Okay. Also in the stratum basale, we have those melanocytes. Those are the ones making brown skin pigment. And there we go, got to switch that to tactile cells. Old PowerPoints, gotta switch them up, which are our sensory receptors, right? So again, this is that deepest layer. These guys are very well protected. They're way down deep here by the dermis. This is nice that we can have these free nerve endings coming all the way up to the skin there. Okay. As we move more superficially, right, we get to the stratum spinosum. Now, stratum spinosum is primarily keratinocytes, right, but we also find that dendritic cell. Remember desmosomes, those were the junctions that held neighboring epithelial cells together. Remember, epithelium is so cellular, we had all those specialized junctions. In spinosum, basically, the name is kind of that these cells look spiny. So this is an artifact of the way this works in histology. So all these cells were kind of, right, anchored together by those desmosomes. And then when the skin is actually put onto a slide, the cells shrivel a little bit. And I can't draw this, but what's left behind, the connections are still there. And so it looks kind of spiny. You don't have to know that, but if it helps you think about it, right, that those cells are held together. Now, in the stratum spinosum, these keratinocytes are really getting filled with keratin, right? They activate that portion of their genetic code that tells them how to make keratin, and so they're kind of getting filled up with that. As you start moving further and further up, even in this layer, you'll start to see that those cells are getting a little bit flatter, a little bit squished. Again, we mentioned dendritic cells being part of the immune system. Okay? So that's what's going on in the stratum spinosum. If we keep going up, right, we have the stratum granulosum. Now the stratum granulosum, you'll notice, is actually quite thin. It's something like 3 to 5 cell layers thick. And at this point, we're really seeing these cells become what we say keratinized, right? That protein is getting fully formed. The cells start flattening. This is actually the part where the nuclei and a variety of organelles are going to start to disintegrate. The cells are basically dying in the stratum granulosum, but that's okay, because what we're going to get then is a whole layer, lots and lots of cells that are actually dead, and therefore we're not worried about injuring them on the skin's surface. Okay? So they're transitioning to dead. They're also filling, along with the keratin, they're also producing a glycolipid. Lipids are water repellent, and so this is actually the layer that helps our skin be much more waterproof as well. Now, remember, epithelium is avascular. We do have blood vessels down here in the dermis, and nutrients are able to diffuse, usually not too many cells away, but they can get some into this layer. Beyond the stratum granulosum, part of this is that glycolipid layer, there's no nutrients getting beyond this, right? And the cells are going to be dead. But again, remember, at this layer, the nucleus and the organelles are already breaking down. We'll recycle anything we can. Now, stratum lucidum is even more superficial to stratum granulosum, but we said it's really only in thick skin, the palms and the soles. I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. Technical difficulties, right? And so then the final layer, and this is maybe a little confusing. So in regular skin, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 layers. In thick skin, there would be an additional layer between these, right? So sometimes you talk about it like 4 layers, sometimes 5. Stratum corneum is the most superficial layer, right? It's what you see when you look at the actual skin. This layer is around 20, 30 cells thick. These cells are completely dead, no nutrients getting to them. They're really just filled with keratin and that glycolipid. Okay? This is protecting all those other underlying layers. These cells are going to fall off. It doesn't matter if a microbe gets in here, it's just going to be shed momentarily anyway. Right? So that is the stratum corneum. Now, okay, stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, stratum corneum. How are you going to remember all of this? So one of the things that's really common to do when you have big chunks of memorization to do is to come up with some kind of mnemonic, right? To say, okay, how do I at least remember the first letter of each of these strata, and then from there I can probably get to the rest of the word. So your book, maybe it was your book, had one, it was like, come let's get sunburnt. It's related to skin, so that helps. A student years ago, and it's still the one that I remember to this day, came up with cats look good sipping beer. Whatever it takes to remember the order of these. If you'd rather come up with a mnemonic that goes the other way, that's also fine. There are also websites, right, mnemonic like builders. You could Google, put in the letters you're trying to come up with a mnemonic for, and it'll spit out a bunch of them. You can decide if one of those is memorable to you. Okay? So you do want to know what the layers are, and what these specialized cells are in each layer, what those cells do. Right? There's a lot going on here in the epidermis. Sorry, way too many bullet points. All right, so a series of questions. We can look at that in class, but maybe you want to think a little bit about the answers to these before you come next week. Okay, so that was the epidermis. Let's talk about the dermis. This won't take near as long here, right? Remember, the dermis, the big thing here is that it's connective tissue, right? Its connective tissue is strong, right? We're thinking about lots of collagen fibers, maybe some elastic and reticular fibers as well, but it's strong, it's flexible. It doesn't have, remember, connective tissue, way less cells, a lot more matrix, that non-cellular component, and again, in this case, mostly that is fibers. The dermis is broken into two layers. Again, we have our cartoon here, and then we'll look at a real picture. The more superficial dermal layer is the papillary layer. Lots of blood vessels here. That's what's going to help us with thermoregulation. We saw those nerve endings going right up to the epidermis. Those are in this papillary layer as well. We see these little ridges, right? That's helping give us this huge surface area to attach the dermis to the epidermis. That papillary layer is made out of areolar connective tissue. Which, if you'll recall, was one of our loose connective tissue propers. Areolar connective tissue has lots of room to accumulate fluid, right? So some water there. This might be a great place to take an injection, to let, say, like that vaccine or something kind of spread out in this tissue that has lots of space. Okay. The other thing that you'll associate here with the papillary layer, with these ridges, that's also what gives you fingerprints, the little friction ridges there. We're going to talk about that. The reticular layer is dense, irregular connective tissue, right? So lots of collagen there, but it can withstand stress in lots of different directions. Okay, so here's our more anatomically accurate. Notice the papillary layer and the reticular layer, there's not like a distinct boundary. They just kind of flow into each other. The areolar connective tissue, again, we see all the nerves, we see all the blood vessels there. The reticular layer, a lot more collagen. A couple kind of interesting things that go with the dermis here, right? So we were talking about fingerprints. This is a creepy picture. It's so magnified. You can actually see the different sweat pores, right? But those friction ridges, that really is that boundary. We call that the dermal papilla. Sorry, let me go back a picture and see. Right, so they're calling it these epidermal ridges, or the part where it bumps up. Notice they're calling that the dermal papilla, and that's what's giving you these fingerprints. Wrong way. Okay. Another interesting thing here, this is in that deeper part of the dermis, the reticular layer. In that dense irregular connective tissue, there are like bundles of collagen that run in very predictable directions. And what people have noticed over the years is that actually, these what they call cleavage lines are really important when you make surgical incisions. You actually want to go in that same direction as the cleavage line in that particular area. The wounds actually heal much better if you kind of work in parallel to that. You also get, in places like your hand, what we call flexure lines, and this is going to be when that reticular layer, when the dermal layer is much more tightly attached to some of these underlying structures. You also get other things that you might be familiar with when you think about the dermis. People talk about stretch marks. So after, say, pregnancy or even like a growth spurt, you can actually get kind of tears in those dermal layers, and they'll show up as little kind of white lines, right? Stretch marks. Oh, and then the other one I was going to mention are blisters, right? A blister, you actually get a separation of the epidermis and dermis, and you get like a little fluid-filled pocket in there, which of course can heal up given enough time. Okay. Last but not least then, and then we'll look at some accessory structures. Last but not least here, the hypodermis. Again, not part of the skin, but a really great place to hold on to insulation in the form of adipose. It is can be a rich reservoir for blood, so we hold some of the extra blood that's not in rapid circulation. And this, hypodermis is actually where you want most of your injections to go, right? They call it a hypodermic needle. It's going to be long enough to reach the hypodermis and absorb whatever kind of injection that you might need to receive there, unless you're trying to do an intramuscular injection, but those are much less common. Okay, a moment to talk about skin pigmentation. We talked a little bit about melanin as one of our pigments here, but we have two other pigments, keratin and really hemoglobin acts as a skin pigment as well, particularly if you don't have much of these two pigments. Basically, the hemoglobin, the redness of your blood is going to show through, and that's why I have this pinkish appearance, right, is that hemoglobin, okay? Keratin, this is actually coming from vegetables like carrots. You can actually accumulate that pigment, keratin, both in the hypodermal layer and also in the keratinocytes. Melanin, of course, is that pigment that we talked about being made by melanocytes in the stratum basale, and how those melanin packets, melanosomes, are actually handed off to keratinocytes. Now here's the thing. This pigment is protective, right? As that melanin moves up through the different strata of the skin, it is blocking UV radiation from damaging the stem cells that are down in the stratum basale. Melanin is a brilliant protective mechanism against UV radiation. I don't have a whole lot of melanin. That leaves me at much higher risk for certain skin cancers. Individuals who have lots of melanin are still at risk of skin cancer and need to be aware of that, right? But basically, both these individuals, right, with very different skin pigmentation, probably have pretty similar numbers of melanocytes, but it's the DNA code, right, how active those cells are going to be at actually producing melanin. Notice that melanin is a really common answer to living near the equator, to having ancestors who come from near the equator, because that is where the sun is most intense and the most protection is needed. But as humans moved out of Africa, Mesopotamia, moved towards the poles, the problem with melanin became that they couldn't make as much vitamin D, right? If you have lots of melanin and you're living near the equator, you're probably still getting enough sun, enough UV exposure to make vitamin D. But if you're living near the poles, right, that melanin is blocking vitamin D production. So there was a mutation that took place in individuals so they didn't make as much melanin, and that was actually beneficial for vitamin D production. So if you think about this, it is absolutely ridiculous. Racism, wars, all the things that it's the genetic code for how to make a pigment. There is absolutely no other difference between those individuals. And so it's ridiculous. Anyway, vitamin D production looks like this. So when you get exposure to UV radiation, it actually is going to interact, they're saying steroid compound, this is essentially cholesterol. Right? So the steroid compound cholesterol, this lipid, as it interacts with UV radiation, the skin is going to produce a chemical called cholecalciferol. That then travels to the liver, right, where it's converted to calcidiol. I don't know why they just called it intermediate product. Calcidiol is the real name. And then that travels through the blood to the kidney where it's converted to calcitriol. Calcitriol is this metabolically active form of vitamin D. Vitamin D then goes to the intestines and helps individuals absorb calcium and phosphate, right? And those are going to be important in strong bones. People without enough vitamin D might develop, if they're growing, they might develop rickets where the bones get kind of flexy. In adults, you might be more concerned about osteopenia or osteoporosis as the bones get weaker.